What would you say are like the top one or two common mistakes that you see coaches make when implementing condensed conjugate?
It's not the end all be all. In exercise science and athletic performance, there's no such thing as absolutes. Whether it be in conjugate, whether it be in triphasic, or even linear progression, right? There has to be variability in mind. You need to place a different stimulus on them so that way they're not just getting the same thing over and over again.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Setless Strength Podcast. We got Kaelan Jones on the podcast today. Kaelan Jones is a world-class combat strength and conditioning coach. He's worked with very high-level athletes in MMA, submission grappling, boxing, wrestling, and everything else in between. Kaelan is an amazing coach and someone that I have an immense amount of respect for, especially when it comes to bridging the gap between formal education. He does have his master's in exercise science and physiology, as well as just training in the gym. In this episode, Kaelan does an amazing job of breaking down several different protocols and templates that you can literally follow yourself to help you pack on slabs of muscle, get stronger, improve your explosive power, and overall just enhance your athleticism as a grappler. This is an episode that I strongly encourage that you listen to a couple times through, so that way you can get all the templates, all the tips, all the practical advice that you can implement into your own training, so ultimately you can lift heavy and roll hard. Enjoy the episode. Kaelan, welcome to the podcast, bro.
Hey, fun man, how's everything been?
It's been good, bro. It's been good. I want to definitely dig into a lot of the awesome stuff you're doing as a coach, both in the gym and on the mat. But I wanted to ask you real quick, like I've been seeing you put up these highlights of going to these grappling tournaments, giving people flying lessons. So I wanted to ask you, what's your experience been kind of like coming from collegiate wrestling and then moving into jiu-jitsu as a competitive athlete? What's that transition been like for you?
Honestly, man, it's been interesting because for me at least, transitioning from that point even into now, like I'm doing a lot of stuff at 10th Planet. So like the coaching aspect now getting into being an athlete again, it's changed my mind so much on just not even just the rule sets, but just I guess just having fun, you could say for lack of better words. I did a Naga tournament, though, the one that you were talking about here, what about a few months back? I want to say July, actually. And it was interesting because it's like, okay, I've been to, a few, what is it? What's that one other tournament? New Breed, Naga. I'm probably gonna do a ADCC one here relatively soon, but just the transition made it so interesting to me because it's like there's some people in blue belt that want to stand up with me. Mind you, for everybody that doesn't know, I'm still a white belt at heart, so I'm still kind of learning how to pass guard and do stuff like that. But the wrestling's still there. But it's been really, really fun. It's like the pace is different. It's not so much 3-2-2 anymore. It's purely just you're going 5 straight minutes, just going hard. You're taking a second to breathe, collect your thoughts, and then now you got to worry about getting choked. And it's just like, man, I'm here for it. Honestly, it's been a good run for the most part.
I love it. Do you have anything on the calendar right now that you're looking to compete in?
There's been a few tournaments that I've had my eyes on. Right now, I'm just kind of just staying locked into training a little bit more, kind of getting the fundamentals down, and just really focusing on just having a better strategy. Because I think that's part of the biggest thing too, is that when wrestlers get into jujitsu, it's a very vast world in terms of just like the fundamentals and stuff. Sure, everybody's going to stand up with you. They're going to probably get a few takedowns here and there, but just even the shoes alone, it's like when I get in on a sweep single or like a low single, guys are just kicking their leg out. And I'm like, what the hell? I just literally got on the leg. Now I got to do this all again. So I've been having to reformulate it, but I have previous experience doing that with previous coaches back in the day, like 2020. So luckily I had a little bit of an understanding, but now kind of tapping back into it, it's getting me back to that point.
Right on, man. I love it. I love it.
Yeah,
Well,
man.
in addition to being an awesome grappling athlete, you're also an amazing coach, and you're a coach that I have an immense amount of respect for. The stuff that you put out, is just as far as content goes on social media, is stuff that I find myself like writing notes on. I'm like, oh, okay, I got to keep that on lock because Kaelan said it, so I'm trying to digest it. And I know you work with a lot of different athletes, pro fighters, competitive grapplers, and most of the audience for this podcast are competitive grapplers or grapplers who they just freaking love training hard. So for you, when you're looking at periodization across a year, how do you typically periodize training for a grappling athlete that's competing multiple times per year and competing more often than, say, like a pro MMA fighter that only has one or two events throughout the year?
So it's interesting because you'll kind of find it a lot of times, even with like, judo, even wrestling too, where since they're going, like you said, year round, it's a constant undulation, right? We're going from up, down, up, down, up, down, but it's a constant progression linearly, right? So a lot of the fundamentals that I work with early on, it's really just been triphasic and a little bit of condensed conjugate as they get closer into the camp. But triphasic has been such a staple for me, at least, because just reading Kyle Dietz training one and training two, especially training two, it really dives deeper into the amortization phases on what they should be focusing on distinctively, right? What you'll find, and even with myself, when I was, learning condensed conjugate a little bit more, was that it's great. It's great when you're building both dynamic strength, maximal strength, all in the same setting, and then you're focusing on, anaerobic dominancy and stuff like that. But what I started to realize was that, like any sort of hypothesis, it has to keep going. There always has to be some sort of evolutionary period. So then what I started integrating a lot more, like I said, was triphasic. And so that really opened my eyes to understanding how an athlete is not only able to control the movement, but being able to hold the position in a given moment of time. Because, in combat sports, it's nothing but stop and go, right? So that static overcome by dynamic, what I try to focus on a lot with the guys early on is teaching them how to move, really. Because the one thing that I always tell people is that you can't drive a Corvette with Honda wheels. So it doesn't matter the amount of force that you have. You may be an explosive athlete, but if you don't have the eccentric control to stabilize and to even do the movement in an efficient manner, it's not going to translate. And more oftentimes than not, you're going to get injured. So what I try to implement is a lot of movement mechanics early on, seeing how they can walk, seeing how they can do single leg stuff. But mostly what I focus on is oblique slings. So across the body, right, from both sides, you have your anterior and your posterior sling. So a lot of that interconnects with how you're going into hip flexion, hip extension, rotation, bending, because it's a combat sport mostly. So what I look for a lot of times is how much torque can they produce in a given movement without there being any sort of limitations. Once I kind of find like usually from like 5 to 7 degrees at best, I start to see a lot of imbalances. And that's commonly across the board with a lot of competitive grapplers. Like one side, they're going to be more dominant in than the other. Sometimes they might have a little bit of some anterior tilt, but it's nothing to the sort of where, there's any sort of deficiency. So from the ground up, what I usually do as far as an assessment goes, I'll start with just like I said, movement mechanics. How are you walking? Are you more externally rotated on the one side than the other? Are you lacking stability on one leg versus the other? How much power are you producing versus another? So then I'll characterize that on a distinct model, and I'll try to run it for about a good 12 weeks. And from that point, let's just say ideally, if they're getting ready for, I don't know, 80 cc 3 months out, that gives me a good enough range to focus a little bit on the fundamentals early on. So at least they have some sort of starting point as opposed to not.
Gotcha, gotcha. For those listening who are unaware of what triphasic training is, can you just briefly break down what that looks like and then kind of how you're breaking up each phase of triphasic training over those 12
Yeah.
weeks?
So Triphasic was created by University of Minnesota strength and conditioning coach Al Dietz. And so he has an extensive resume as far as everybody in Minnesota, all Americans, Olympic champions, things to that matter, even pro athletes. And so what he found was that through deriving the Russian methodology, that if we were to train the athlete in distinct phases, you're looking at eccentric, which is the loading pattern. You're slow and controlled, trying to be able to control the tempo. You're also looking at isometrics, which is the pausing point, right? And then concentrics being the shortening cycle. You're exploding, triple extension, all the sorts, right? So what he found was that if I'm able to put an athlete, let's just say a belt squat, for example, if I'm able to put an athlete under a belt squat for a 5, even a 3 second tempo, and I'm having them constantly go into it almost like an overspeed, you're looking at like 92, 97%. And sometimes it may even get to that maximal point, the supermax. So what he found shortly thereafter was that from a BPM standpoint, physiologically, that athletes were able to get their heart rates down from 48 all the way down to 37, which is crazy because just from 2 weeks alone of just doing purely eccentrics, I'm not going to be a diehard, Joel Seaman or anything of that sort, but just to that point, it's like they they have such a very keen way of understanding how to perform a movement and then being able to progress it in a 2 week model. So you're looking at eccentrics 2 weeks, you're looking at isometrics for another 2 weeks, and then you have the concentric phase, which would be the last week. Now that's just a 6 week block. If we're talking, like I said, in a 12 week setting, I'm probably going to focus a little bit more within a 3 weeks threshold of eccentrics, just for them to get an understanding as to how to control movement and do things like that. Now, the downside to it is that you don't want to overwhelm the stimulus way too much, right? You don't want to cost their central nervous system because we have to remember that these guys are combat athletes. They're constantly training 2 to 3 times a day. You're looking at about 12 to 15 times a week, right? So within this threshold, I try to make sure that we're touching enough points early on in training so that way they're not being deficient getting into the training session itself.
Gotcha. So if I'm understanding correctly, if someone has an ADCC Open or ADCC trials in 12 weeks, you'll spend those first 6 weeks taking them through a more traditional triphasic model, 2 week eccentric phase. You're doing heavy tempo belt squats on the eccentric or the lowering phase, maybe even doing something like some overloading stuff where you have weight releasers, or maybe you're doing, super max bench press, bringing it down. Someone else is helping you lift it back up. You'll run that for 2 weeks. Then in the isometric phase, are you just doing yielding isometrics where you're holding a static position against resistance? Or are you mixing in other isometrics like overcoming isos, box squats, or static overcome by dynamic? How are you modeling the isometric phase?
So doing a lot of yielding. Um, if I'm looking at it from like a benching standpoint, most people don't really know how to bench. So what I'll do is I'll put almost like a pin press or like a block, and it teaches them how to control that response at that mid range, so that way they're able to drive through the movement efficiently. In other cases, I'll also include velocity based training too. That's been a really great staple of mine as well. For those that don't know what velocity based training is, you're basically taking a device, kind of like a dynamometer almost, and you're attaching it to the bar itself, and you're focusing on creating pretty much different responses in speed time. This is going to factor in more within isometrics and concentrics. What this does is that it helps with regulating programming a lot more easier. So rather than me having to just eye it all the time, if they may tell me, okay, how are you feeling 1 out of 10? They tell me, okay, I feel like a 4, but then they're performing like an 8. What does that showcase to me? Either I need to back off of the weight and we need to just keep it purely submaximal, or we go into a different phase where we now start to understand, okay, what is he getting deficient in and what do we need to focus on in terms of repeatability? And that's where a lot of like that tempo work starts to come into play, because when you start doing overcoming, especially early on in the training, you start to see a lot of downgrading in the movement itself. And so just to kind of put an understanding in their minds is just getting them to see, okay, when we're going through the movement, especially like I said, from a benching standpoint, we're not so much focusing on trying to control the movement coming down. That's going to be a byproduct of it. But we're focusing on creating as much maximal tension at the bottom as we can, so that way we're driving through the movement. And that is going to play into, somebody trying to get into your guard, you're trying to push away and escape. If we're talking about, isometric strength, we'll add a little bit of some sandbags and stuff here and there just for grip strength. But for the most part, between the isometric phase and velocity-based training, that would be the last 4 weeks of the triphasic of the triphasic that I would be focusing on with them.
Gotcha. So if we were to use like an example or like lay out a template, just using something for like the lower body, 2 weeks, it'd be a belt squat, loading up something really, really heavy, doing a 3 to 5 second tempo on the way down. Maybe like in week 2, you add something, 102 or 103% of your max and do like some just heavy eccentric only reps, followed by 2 weeks of some isometric holds where you're squatting down. Are you trying to drop down fast and then like turn on the brakes as fast as possible? Or are you still having a
Yeah.
controlled tempo, holding and then exploding back up?
Yeah, absolutely. And part of that being is that, like I said, we don't want to spend so much time, especially after the second or third week of eccentrics, because we have to keep in perspective again that you're looking at 12 to 15 hours worth of training, right? So part of that being is that we have to make sure that early on they have the work capacity to be ready. So whether we're doing, EMOMs, whether we're doing things of that manner, we also have to use that in a way to where we're modeling out, okay, how much of a response am I getting from this point and how much can they repeat it over time? And part of that is that with the isometrics, there's a lot of studies out there that you can find. You can build maximal strength within a short period of time, but you also want to keep it in the window, like anything, for about 2 to 3 weeks, because again, the central nervous system plays such a big role in athletic performance that even if you may feel, and again, the key word is feel, like you can go through the movement, numbers don't lie. So if I'm seeing a guy that's not being able to maintain, let's just say 80 to 85%, that's going to showcase to me that, okay, either there's some type of rate limiting factor here and we need to regress it, or we need to go to something completely different based on the training parameters that I've set for them.
Mm. So with that 2 weeks eccentric, 2 weeks isometrics, that
Mhm.
last phase, that reactive phase, are you keeping the same movement pattern? So like we did, heavy eccentric squats for 2 weeks, pause squats for 2 weeks. Now we're doing like banded squats or box squats against chains or something that's a little bit more explosive with the same movement pattern. Or are you
Yeah.
changing up movement patterns? How's it? Are you working the end of that phase?
So I try not to mix up the main lifts too much just because we want to keep the stimulus responsive, right? And part of that being is that when you kind of start mixing and matching, and you kind of see it a lot in powerlifting too, where like, okay, one week we may do, a heavy box squat, then another week we may do, like a regular squat. Though it adds variability, which is important, for them as an athlete, you want to keep the same response going within that 6 week panel. So that way they're not being exposed to other different things. Because again, if we're talking from an acquisition standpoint, if they don't know how to box squat efficiently, why am I going to put them underneath that response? If they're doing a better job just split squatting or even, like I said, belt squatting, it's better to keep that point reinforced so that way they understand the movement and they're evolving over time, right? If I'm having to spend a little bit more time teaching them like a clean and jerk, that's majority of the camp, right? They're not really going to be able to master it until whenever. And so that would be something that I would focus more in camp in terms of just, minimum effective dosage. What is the minimum effective exercises that we can use within this period of time to get the greatest response possible, right? And if we're talking power production, that's one of many that you can utilize in terms of training and programming.
Hmm. Are you familiar with any of Jay Schroeder's extreme isometrics, and have you mixed any of those in during the isometrics phase?
Actually, no. I've been reading a little bit about it, but if you have some familiarity on it, like you can more than willing.
I'll say this, like I've just been testing it out and I've slowly started having my own athletes do it and it feels crazy. And I probably need to like bring someone on the podcast who's an actual expert in this kind of stuff because I just saw it on Instagram. I was like, yeah, for sure. I'll run it. But essentially what it is, it's like you're holding the bottom position of any sort of movement, bottom of a squat, bottom of a push-up, uh, you know, whatever movement you want, and you're holding that position for Jay Schroeder in some of his original articles, he's talking like 3 to 5 minutes, which is absolutely insane. So when I first
Mhm.
started it, I was doing it for 3 sets of 1 minute. And what I found was not only did just like physically after a couple of weeks, like all the connective tissue, my tendons, my ligaments, everything just felt way stronger and more durable. But I also found that it highlighted a lot of weaknesses that I wasn't necessarily being exposed to when I did other kinds of yielding isometrics. So like if I did, a regular squat and was doing a 3 second or a 5 second pause at the bottom, I felt pretty good doing that. And I felt pretty strong in that. It was challenging, but I still felt okay. But once I did the extreme isometrics where I was holding that bottom position for 1 to 3 minutes, I haven't done a 5 minute one yet. I still got to build myself back up. I felt different muscles fatiguing way faster. And it just highlighted to me like, oh, geez, like certain parts of my adductors are really weak, or certain parts of my pec minor are really weak. So it's just something fun that I've been mixing in, and I found it to be pretty beneficial for my own training. And I'm starting to have some of my own athletes do it too.
Nice. What is some of the things you've been noticing, like from an isometric standpoint, like just doing that? I know that you said a lot of different muscles are being activated, but like how are you feeling like after training, like the day after?
The first time I did it, I was cooked. I was absolutely obliterated. I was so sore afterwards. But I've been running it probably like every other phase of training for about a year now. So now I feel like I can mix them in. And like if I lift in the morning and I do some extreme isos, if I go to jujitsu later that day, I'm going to feel it a little bit, but by the next day, I feel pretty good. And so when I started implementing, I'm not competing anymore. So the pros of that is that if I feel like extra smoked after a training session, it's really not a big deal because I'm not worried about how it's going to impact my prep for competition. So once I kind of got a good feel for how my body was responding to the extreme isos, I started mixing it into some of my athletes' off-season training. So that way, if they also kind of had that same feeling of being crazy, crazy sore afterwards, it was totally fine because it was in their off-season. We're, 24 weeks out from their next competition. And I'm not necessarily having anybody do it in training camp yet, but I think it's one of those things that for me has been a good lever to pull for some guys when we're getting in shape for training camp. And if they can go through a phase of extreme isos before training camp starts, the ligaments, the tendons, their shoulders, their hips, their hamstrings, their elbows, like all those parts that as grapplers are just always getting chewed up, they tend to feel pretty good going into training camp as opposed to before where sometimes they're starting training camp with their elbow a little bit banged up or their shoulder kind of barking at them a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I've noticed that a lot too. It's like when, especially in triphasic, like you start to see a lot of the weaker points, not just in the eccentric phase, but isometrics. And within it, like you said, it exposes a lot of muscles and a lot of tendons that you're not utilizing as efficiently. Part of that too is that I would also incorporate like oscillation work. So like, getting a lot of bands, bamboo bars, stuff like that, and kind of getting them to understand how to hold the position. And part of that being is that I've noticed that there's a lot more greater proprioception that they're building awareness to. But then also it's a good real rehabilitation pattern too, especially for a guy that's been injured or like you said, has a banged up shoulder, focusing on those movements allows me to kind of see, okay, what do we need to work around? Not even just the muscle and the joint itself, but other, key factors like, tricep work or even grip strength, because obviously that's going to be the number one indicators, right? Like when I have some grapplers that are coming in, like they'll be, banged up from training, stuff like that. And we're already talking from the beginning of the week. So one of the things that I actually measure with them, if I am going to be doing like oscillation work, would be getting a grip tester. So usually within this range, like I said, this gives me a good indicator of not only seeing how good of grip strength that they have, how long can they hold it over time, and if there's any other nagging injuries that they may have from the shoulder. So if we're just saying off of, let's just say off of 100 pounds, if I see maybe like a 5 to 7% drop off, we'll start to kind of submaximally do the training demands itself, so that way they're not impeding so much and we're not losing, the stimulation that we need for the training session itself.
Is that something you have them do before every session or only when you see like, hey, I think this guy looks a little banged up. Let's just test his grip just to see where he's at.
A little bit of both, because some of them have a tendency where they can play it off and they're like, "Oh, I'm fine. It's not a big deal." But then again, numbers don't lie. So if I'm seeing that you're doing really well one day, but then the next day it's dog trash, I'm gonna look at it as, okay, let's make a good enough assessment and say we're not gonna do this today, even though that you could do it, right? It's still kind of like, okay, I'm making the educated decision to say, look, you're better off doing this, getting a greater response on the back end of this versus trying to heavy set everything, because at a certain point your body's going to tire out, right? And even if you're getting toward the later end of the week and if you're going live drills and rolls and things like that, your body's going to have to be affected. And that's one of the things that I've noticed too, is like they put so much duress on themselves. And again, it's part of the sport. I get it. I understand. I've done the 2 to 3 sessions a day sort of thing. But there also has to be a point where you have to say no, right? Whether it be for yourself, whether it be somebody, a coach, or somebody to that manner that's not putting so much, oh, you need to train, you need to train. Yes, training's important, right? But recovery is just as important in the training itself. And so sometimes, like I said, is that if I'm seeing them come in, dog tired, oh, I just went through an hour of just straight going live. Okay, we're not going to focus so much on heavy lifting today. We may keep it sub-maximal, or if they can't even do sub-maximal, we may just do movement prep, just getting them mobilized, getting them making sure that we're not putting them in a position where they're falling toward the end of the week, but they're also ready to go in the next time of training session, whether it be in jujitsu, wrestling, judoka, MMA. So it's one of those things where it's like it's a matter of knowing your body and knowing the limits that you can take with it, you know?
A couple of years ago, I was talking with DeAndre Corbet, who won ADCC West Coast Trials a couple of years ago. He won the Zapatero Invitational, just
Okay.
amazing world-class grappler. And he was telling me about how he has three objective readiness markers that he tracks every single day and three subjective readiness markers that he tracks every single day. And I don't even think he looks at them. I think he said he just automatically sends them to his coaches and then they change training based off of what those are. So you mentioned grip strength, which I believe is one that DeAndre uses every day. Are there any other readiness markers that you're using either from a subjective standpoint or an objective standpoint?
So I used to use ParkQ a lot, but then I realized that, hey, ParkQ is not really going to be a good source of understanding. Like, okay, they may just say, okay, I feel great today over and over. Sometimes it just comes down to knowing the athlete, right? Like I have a few people that come in here and like you can just kind of tell that they're kind of dogging it. And what I've assessed from a subjective standpoint is doing A skips, right? How I know that the session is going to be good is based on how they do the movement. Now, I'm not saying you need to be a Saquon Barkley or Tyreek Hill performing an A skip at a crazy manner, but just I can tell based on a motor coordination pattern that if you're kind of just dogging the movements, that lets me know, okay, there's going to need to be a little bit of a setback, right? Another thing too is we also have force plates here as well. So I'll have them do like, counter movement jumps, and I'll use that trend based off of what I see in a 2 week manner, just assessing saying, hey, you did this last week, you did this the other week, but now you're starting to go down a little bit. Not a bad thing, but again, if we're going off of just like I said, 3 to 5, even 7%, if there's a drop off, we're going to take it a little bit back and then focus a little bit more on the things that they could be needing, whether it be, grip strength, whether it be strength endurance or lack thereof. So I try my best not to push so much alactic in the beginning, even though that's just the response that everybody wants. I may focus a little bit more on glycolytic, like we're going a minute duration, we're going 30 seconds. We're still kind of tapping into that threshold, but not so much to where we're depleting the central nervous system every single time that we're coming in here, right? And that's kind of the mindset that I've had for the last few years. And especially like with grappling, it's kind of hard to get them out of the mindset because, oh, well, my coach tells me that I need to go 100% every single day. That's great, but what is your body telling you right now? I remember you were saying the other day about the Whoop indicator. Like a lot of people now are using that as like an objective base. But in terms of that, it's like, okay, if we're going off of this objective marker, sure, your sleep levels may not be where you want them to be, but if you're training really well at a high level, go, right? Let that be an indicator, but don't let that be the absolute. And I think a lot of people have that tendency where it's like, okay, well, either I'm all in or I'm all out. And it's like in exercise science and athletic performance, there's no such thing as absolutes, right? We have a variable, we're testing the variable. We know that the hypothesis works. Now it's just a matter of using certain methodologies to help with formulating the decision that we need to make down the road.
To kind of circle back to something really interesting that you said earlier was about the oblique sling. So how does training the oblique sling, and maybe if you can break down what that is for the audience, how does that get incorporated into some of the phases of training that you're taking your athletes through? And then is there that kind of same progression that you're talking about where at the start of camp, maybe we don't go all gas, no brakes, but we're still kind of hitting these touch points and training the oblique sling. And then towards the end of camp, we're just sending it all the way and having them do some really crazy stuff.
Yeah. So the oblique sling, think of like a rubber band that kind of goes across your body, right? The best way that I can create the analogy is that when you're looking at a fighter throwing across, right, that whole right or left lining of the body is being activated. So we're talking from the shoulder, we're talking from the hip, we're talking from the glute. Everything helps with creating torque, right? So again, part of the pre-assessment phase that I go through with them, whether they be a fighter or a grappler, is seeing how far that they can go into a given range without there being any sort of deficiencies. Now, granted, there's going to be a lot because they're compensating from one side to another. From an asymmetrical response, it's not bad for your body to be stronger on one side more than another. But if we're talking again from an injury standpoint, there has to be a point where we're focusing on the muscles or at least the ligaments around it. So that way we can produce a better result toward the middle, if not the end of camp, right? So what I'll usually have a lot of them do is like I'll have them do like a split stance hold on the wall, and I'll just kind of like let them hold themselves in a position, almost like a mummy, and I'm having them torque to the same side leg that's in front. Now that'll allow me to assess like, okay, not only are they getting compression expansion on both sides, but how are they moving in a given range without there being any sort of, like I said, deficiencies. A lot of times what I found is that even if you have them hold in that position, a lot of responses it's internal rotation. It's a lot of lack of oblique contraction, things like that. So a lot of the stuff that I'll have them do early on is a lot of split base work, having them do like side raises, farmer carries, things like that. Even though that it's imposing kind of like just a sagittal response, we're allowing them to understand that through given movements, this is what's going to be contracted when you're getting into a single leg, when you're playing guard, even when you're in spider or della riva, right? And a lot of these muscles that you're utilizing, it all encompasses within the posterior chain. So overall, we're working on the posterior chain every single moment of every single day because this is what's going to not only help you stabilize, but this is also going to take away, if not mitigate, some of the injury responses that you have, right? I had a guy a few months back. He had a lot of sciatic nerve issues, SI, sacroiliac. And so I would notice that whenever he'd move, right, there would always kind of be like that lagging step. And so part of the prehab process that I took him through was a little bit of some PRI stuff and just getting him to understand, okay, what are you feeling from a 90-90 from an elevated position? Sometimes I'll have them put like a yoga block or like medicine balls between their legs and just creating that isometric response. So where now if something's turning on, great, that's excellent. But if something's not turning on, how can we improve that response when we're getting into training, right? And so I've noticed that a lot of times, especially in jujitsu, where a lot of that interior tilt kind of comes into play. Like you have guys that are just hypermobile out the ass. Like it's just like I've seen guys that can literally, especially in rubber guard too. Like a lot of the 10th planet guys, they're able to get their legs past a given point and they're feeling great. Okay, I can get the move, I can execute and do stuff like that. But when they come out of the training, they're like, I wonder why like my ass is hurting. I'm like, you know why your ass is hurting because you're always in this position all the time. So we have to build the muscle. We have to build the ligaments and the tendons around it. So I'll incorporate, PRI, a little bit of some FRC just to kind of assess the range of motion, but nothing where it's overtaxing them. And that's just my biggest thing is that they're going to be doing the stuff regardless. My job is to make sure that I'm building the engine, not repairing it.
Gotcha. So if I understand correctly, when you're talking about the oblique sling, it sounds pretty similar to some of the spinal engine stuff that the Landmine University guys are talking
Yeah.
about. Is that essentially the same thing? Spinal engine, oblique sling?
Yeah. So Alex has done a really great job of just breaking down compression and expansion, and even so David Weck. And what I found out was that even from just doing, movements on the landmine, you're able to expand one side. You're utilizing the muscles that you need to open one side and then compress the other. And you see that all the time, whether it be in running, whether it be in getting it on a double leg, and like I said, throwing across as an MMA fighter. So all these things factor into how your body and how your spine is coordinated in these given motions and how much power you're producing. And so part of that is I would look at that from a point of saying, okay, if we're able to have one side contract more than the other, let me see what we can do on the back end to help them get a better understanding, not even just from a strengthening response, but just from mobility. Because again, a lot of them lack the spinal fluidity, as you would call it, just to get into certain ranges. Okay, even though that this is a functional movement, right? We need to be able to centralize and see what markers are we looking at in this given point, so that way we're constantly hitting this every single session at least 1 to 2 times a week, right? And it's such a great thing. And like I've used Alex's stuff for a very long time. It's been such a great thing for me because again, I don't want to spend all my time trying to teach somebody how to clean and jerk. I can do it, right? But that takes away 30, 45 minutes of the session. And if we're talking about we only see them 1, 2 times a week, we're talking only 2 hours a week in total, but that first 30 minutes equivalates to an hour, and I'm spending more of my time doing that. So what are the most effective things that I can do, like the landmine or even doing things with med balls or band work or things like that. So where I'm not having to take such much of a time away from the training, but they're still getting what they need from it.
Hey, real quick, if you want to become a jacked and dangerous grappler this year and you want to consistently feel and perform your best both in the gym and on the mat, you need to take a much deeper look at your health. You may not even realize that there could be some serious health markers and things going on with your hormones that are holding you back from being able to get brutally strong, pack on slabs of muscle, and improve your grappling athleticism. That's why I partnered with Merrick Health, because I wanted to get on track to fully optimize my performance and my health. They run lab tests that check over 100 different biomarkers, and by working with one of their expert coaches, I was able to get a personalized roadmap that tackled everything from supplementation, nutrition, hormone optimization, really everything that I needed to start seeing results and improving my performance in just a couple of weeks. You can get the exact same blood panels that I get and the ones that I order for all of my athletes, plus get 10% off your initial assessment by going to the link in the description below and using code SETLAGE at checkout. That's merrickhealth.com, code SETLAGE to get 10% off your initial assessment. Now, back to the show. For someone listening to this podcast, they're most likely a grappler that's between like late 20s, early 30s, like around, our age, so to speak. Some of them compete quite a bit. Some of them just love training hard. If we were to build out like a week of training where we want to kind of hit all these touch points, where we want to get some bilateral stuff, we want to get some oblique sling, spinal engine stuff, we want to get some accessory work, and they only have 3 days per week to go to the gym, how would you structure a week of training to make sure they kind of check all those boxes?
So first thing I would do is that if I'm competing and let's just say I don't have a coach, I want to think about what's going to put the most taxation on my body throughout the week. If it's going to be training, I would segregate the days based on, okay, if I know that I'm going to be training hard this day, I'm going to use Monday as my source to where I'm getting everything in. So I'll get my main lift, or more so, I'll get my warm-ups in first, whether it be prehab stuff, whether it be on the wall, getting some CNS response work, whether it be like med balls, things like that, just to get the core going. And then I'll get into the main lift, right? And so part of the main lift, like I said, is that if you're going off of triphasic or if you're going off of no progression at all, the main lift, whether it be squat, bench, deadlift, or even a landmine press, overhead press, that's fine too. Using that, what you would do at that point is now say, okay, I have the muscles that I've been utilizing. Now let me work on the supplemental side. So let's say if you did a bench press and you started to notice that at the bottom end of the bench, you're lacking lat stability, right? We may go into a single arm row. We may go into some pendlay rows. We may go into even chain pull-ups, right? That's been a very big thing of mine too. It's seeing that, okay, the amount of power that I need from the back end, and again, this all works in the posterior chain. If I'm supplementing that based on my main lift, that's going to allow me to get the response that I need early on. Now you get into the accessories. The accessories usually typically range from like 3, maybe 4 exercises. So trying not to overwhelm so much. So at best, you're looking at about 4 to 6 exercises within the lift scheme itself. Anything past that, unless you're taking a little bit more time to prehab or do stuff like that, maybe 7, but at best 4 to 6, right? And then you have conditioning at the end. But now what they're showcasing is that it's actually not good to lift, or not only good to lift during training, but also doing conditioning right after, right? Because if you're talking about building strength, even though that an elastic response is necessary, right? You need that. You're also looking at it from a point of, if you're trying to build muscle, and you're also going into jujitsu, 6, 7 hours later, it's a little bit deficient because now you're taking the time away from what you need to get to build the strength to get the gains, but then you're also going into the session 6, 7 hours later. That's a good window, but we're even talking about 3 to 5 minutes. Like, okay, at best, I would probably spend about, like I said, a minute, maybe two, maybe three on conditioning, maybe five at best, if you're very competitive. But otherwise, I would try to separate the days where I am doing strength training and what I'm going to be conditioning, because in the conditioning side, you're going to see a lot more of a greater response at that point because now you're allowing yourself to actually focus on what type of intervals that you're working, whether it be Tabitha, whether it be 30 on, 30 off, or even just other sort of conditioning methods at that point.
I love it. I love it. You're getting into one of my favorite subjects, which is the stimulus recovery adaptation curve. And
Yeah.
anytime I'm doing consult calls or just like chopping it up with people after class, I usually always find a way to bring that up because I think if someone understands the stimulus recovery adaptation curve, it basically solves all the other problems in their training. So if I understand what you're saying correctly, you're saying when we have our strength work, we want to make sure that that's our biggest stimulus for that session. If we add in another stimulus like conditioning, it's not to say that like we're going to waste all our muscle and we're just going to like shrivel up, but that will mean that we're not making the strongest adaptation to the stimulus of strength. And if you want to make the strongest adaptation to the stimulus of strength, keep strength as the strength session. And then on another day, you go all gas, no brakes on your conditioning. So that way you can make the greatest adaptation to that conditioning stimulus. Am I hearing you
Yeah.
correctly in that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Nice, nice. So if we're breaking down that session, they go into the gym, they look at the clock, they're like, all right, it's 5 a.m. I start work, at 7. So I gotta at the most I gotta dip out of here at 6:30. I got 90 minutes. Go into the gym. Maybe they do a little bit of mobility work. Maybe they do some low intensity plyometrics to kind of like be as part of their warm up. They hit their main lift, and that main lift would be the one that focuses on the triphasic training, depending on what phase that they're in, the eccentric, isometric, or reactive phase.
Yep, absolutely.
After they hit that main lift, then they go into their secondary lift, which it sounds like you picking secondary lifts based on whatever weaknesses come up inside the main lift.
Yep.
And then from there, you follow it up with some accessories. And are the accessories just for like whatever the athlete's goal are? Like, hey, I want to build muscle. So like your accessories are all bodybuilding stuff, or my shoulder's injured. So it's all focused on that. How are you picking accessories?
So I pick accessories based on the main lift, right? Like I said, if you're going off of a bench press, right, what are the main components of what's being used, right? You're looking at shoulders, you're looking at your lats, triceps, forearm strength, even biceps as well. So any auxiliary movement that would help encompass improving those pieces, again, and you have to look at it from like a body armor standpoint, right? Our goal is to not only build hypertrophic responses in those given movements, but at the same time, if you're looking to try to PR, which I know most people are, it's like, okay, I want to focus on the weaknesses that I feel in this movement. So that way, when it comes down to the third or fourth week, when I start PRing, okay, this is what I want to focus on. And now it doesn't mean that you have to go gung ho every single 4 weeks, right? You can give yourself like a good 5 to 6 weeks of this consistent training. And then when your body feels ready for it, okay, PR in that given movement. Now, it's also to say that when you're doing auxiliary, you also want to focus on reps in reserve, right? And that's a really good thing that I've noticed too, and even in my own training, right? I don't necessarily like to go off of 8 to 10, 10 to 12, 12 to 15. I'll probably get close to like an IR or RIR 3 reps in reserve. And what that would look like is just kind of getting close to failure, but having 3 reps left in the tank, right? But the goal is not to obviously wither yourself down. It's to kind of give yourself a good marker to understand, okay, if I knew that last week I did about 12 reps of, let's just say rollback extensions for 35 pounds, I can stay with that same 35 pounds and then now incorporate an additional 3, right? Next week, you could say, okay, let's go 40 pounds, go back to what you were doing originally, because again, we're talking about progressive overload. You're looking at a greater response, not only in recovery, but also the blood pump that you get from doing the movement. And you want to be able to make sure that you're doing the movement in a way where you're not bleeding out in terms of repetition, right? So if you want to hit a consistent 12 reps, let that be your consistent 12 reps, right? And until you start to get closer to the point where you are going to failure, unless you're doing it for band work or you're building muscle, I would try to stay within a range of 2 to 3 because, again, we're looking at competitive grapplers. You need all the strength and the recovery that you get going into your training session. So, staying within those reserves is what's going to help you build the muscle that you need, but you're not overtaxing your body from a volume response.
Got it. Got it. I thank you so much. I think that's awesome to have for the people listening. That's like a full nuts to bolts breakdown of what a session could look like. If we're zooming out a little bit, we talked a lot about how you're using the triphasic training model for the first half of a 12-week camp, 2 weeks eccentric, 2 weeks isometric, 2 weeks doing a little bit more reactive based stuff. Those last 6 weeks of training camp, are you just running through triphasic again? Are you shifting more into more traditional condensed conjugate or maybe French contrast? What does the last 6 weeks of training camp look like for a competitive grappler?
So I would focus on the first 4 weeks of just doing condensed conjugates. So we're looking at a maximal strength movement, whether it be upper or lower, and then you would contrast that with a dynamic movement, whether it be upper or lower. So let's just say in a scheme, I have one of my fighters doing a maximal lower, but then a dynamic upper, right? We would focus on that, but I would kind of change it in a way to where we're not spending so much time trying to build strength, but more so the intensity gradient, right? Typically, you want to go off of the 80 to 95% range, nothing more than that. So you're looking at a minimum 5 to 3 reps. If you want to add an additional rep, fine. But for the most part, I'm focusing on making sure that they're consistently doing the movement without breakdown. From that point, when we get into submaximal, I know traditionally some people may go 5 by 5, some people may go 10 by 2, 8 by 2, 6 by 2. It's whatever your body is capable of doing within that point, but you're not spending so much time trying to do the movement excessively, right? You want to have, especially in the submaximal point, anywhere from about 30 to 45 seconds. If you start to notice a breakdown, I'd probably cut it off within whatever set scheme that you're doing. So at best, maybe, like I said, 6 to 2, 8 to 2, 10 to 2. If you're doing like a heavier, like a deadlift of some sort with accommodator resistance, you can go 3 to 5s. But at best, if you're just trying to build, elastic endurance or anything like that, probably about 2 to 5 reps at best.
Gotcha. And is that for the secondary movement? Like your work, if take the deadlift, for example, you have a deadlift variation, you work up to, say, a 3 rep max, take about 10-15% off the bar, and then you're hitting your 3 by 5 or your 6 by 2, depending on what you can do well with proper form.
Yeah, absolutely.
Gotcha. And then how does that, moving on to the rest of the session, how do you bring in the dynamic effort stuff?
So a lot of what I would focus on is taking away the auxiliary movements, especially if we're talking in that 4 week model. Um, I would focus a little bit more on band work. So less of an eccentric, less of an isometric, and more just purely concentric. So I may go like, banded pull downs for like 15, 20 reps. I may do at best, maybe some ballistic exercises, maybe some throws, maybe some banded swings, things like that, but nothing to where we're impeding so much on the tax game. Because again, since it's going to be an intense session, you're looking at about 8 to 9. You don't want to bring it any more up to a 10, right? So the focal point would just be focusing on, okay, how much can we put into the body without impeding so much stress? Because again, the stress is going to come early on, especially if you're getting into 85%, 90%, even 95, right? I've had some guys that can just go through the movement, which is, fascinating. Yeah, you're a freak athlete. But again, we're talking based on variability, right? You may be able to do it good one week, but the next week, if it's trickling into, not only your sessions, but the training sessions that we're doing, it's saying that, okay, we need to take a little bit of a step back and being more responsive on how the body's responding to various stimulus.
With that in mind, on the dynamic effort work, are you using a kind of like bilateral, more traditional lift for the max effort work? And then on the dynamic effort, you're implementing more of that oblique sling where instead of doing like a heavy deadlift for max effort and then a speed bench press, you're doing a heavy deadlift for max effort and then mixing in some of those medicine ball throws that you were talking about, or something that has a little bit more oblique sling spinal engine focus.
Yeah. So if we're getting into like the last 4 weeks, like I'm talking purely the 4 week model, what I would focus on, especially, is kind of it kind of molds itself into French contrast and PAP. So I'll kind of bleed a little bit of that into it, so that way their body gets neural focused on getting into the next phase of training, which would be, like I said, French contrast or PAP. But for the guys that are competing, especially grapplers, I'm not a big fan of cutting weight now. Unless you're cutting weight, I'm not against it, by all means, but it's not really something that you should be focusing on, right? Your goal is to try to get as fast, powerful, quick, all the above in such a given moment in time. So if you're deciding that, hey, you want to cut weight within this, obviously do it in a way to where you can manage, the training adaptation, but don't put yourself in the deep end and just say, hey, I'm going to try to do this to the best progression. Take a step back if you need to, right? And especially with something like French contrast and PAP, it can do a lot to your body. You can perform really well on it, right? And I've seen even in just a 2 week setting, like, benching, squatting, deadlifting improves by like 10, 15% because there's such a neural focused moment where now you're contrasting a movement. You may be doing an iso movement with it. You may be doing all of the sorts of various things with it. But again, like anything, if you're putting so much stress and demand on the body, there's going to be a level of breakdown that ends up happening. And so you end up being in much more of a catabolic state than you need to, especially if you're cutting weight, because now you're not necessarily focused on just cutting weight alone. You're focusing more on, okay, I need to be as intense as possible when it really should only focus like 30, 45 minutes within that session.
Gotcha. So if I understand what you're saying correctly, as we get closer and closer to the day of the competition, you'll pick movements and exercises, especially with some of the dynamic effort stuff that's a little bit more congruent or specific to movement patterns that they're just already going to be using in competition. If you're working with an MMA fighter, they're already going to be throwing jabs and crosses. So you might implement a medicine ball throw that kind of mimics some of that rotational movement real close to the fight. Or with a grappler, you might use some dynamic effort stuff that's more specific to some of the lifts or some of the throws that they're going to be using in competition.
Yeah. So, and especially if we get close to like a week or two out, I'll strictly take away all weights and just focus on band work and just plyometrics. Because at that point, you can add maybe at best one heavy lift just to kind of stimulate the body. But in terms of everything else, we're looking at things from a joint capacity perspective, right? We don't want to put so much stress onto the joints because, again, we're talking about 12 to 15 hours in total of the week just training alone. So the less is more at that point. And I've noticed that, for some fighters and even some coaches that I've talked to, they get a little bit flustered toward the end of the week because it's like, okay, I don't know if I should work into this the next week, but based on how the athlete's responding, I just don't know. And so when I look at that and say, keep it as simple as possible. Try not to over expound on doing so many rounds or try to simulate things that they're going to do in the fight because at the end of the day, they're there just to improve capacity. They're there to improve the adaptations that they need. So really less is more. If you give them a heavy lift, you give them a contrast movement, whether it be with bands or with a med ball, keep it at that, keep it simple, and then give them the rest that they need. If you want to add some conditioning to it shortly thereafter, nothing to where you're expounding more so past, alac or not alactic, but like glycolysis or things like that, especially if you're cutting weight.
Gotcha. I love it. I think this is all going to be so insanely helpful for the people listening and giving like an actual breakdown of how to structure training throughout the week, how to structure a singular session, kind of how to structure a training camp. As much as I love social media and credit social media for helping get my business started, I think the biggest downside of social media is that the information is just too short. And a lot of people start collecting these individual pieces and don't necessarily know how to fit all those individual pieces together. And so I'm super thankful for you coming on the show to help kind of break down, okay, how do we fit all those puzzle pieces together so that way a competitive grappler understands how to train throughout training camp and ultimately lead to a great performance.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the many pitfalls that I've noticed, whether it be with an MMA and or jujitsu, is that they put themselves in a position where now they try to compress so much information all into one. Oh, I have to do this, or I have to do that, or I have to do all these things. When it's like, again, simplicity is the best thing that you can do at this point in time right now, right? If you're a week or 2 weeks out, the focus shouldn't be how much weight you should be lifting. It shouldn't be how intense you should be going in every single session. That's a byproduct of it. But we want to just keep you ready. We want to keep you maintained. And especially like right now, I have a fighter that's getting ready for a CFFC title shot. This camp, I've spent very less time trying to get him to get to the best point that he needs. He's already there, right? Now it's just a matter of keeping him maintained so that way when he gets into the fight, he's not having to think about, oh, I can't pop off my back foot like I used to because I spent so much time trying to lift, a heavy box squat for three the week before, right? So within these pitfalls, again, you're looking at variability. Variability, again, is going to be such the greatest thing at this point because not every athlete is going to respond the same way, right? Somebody that may be explosive may be deficient in, just low steady state training. So instead of me trying to put so much duress on them at the end of camp, we'd focus on that in the beginning of camp. If somebody is a volume striker, let's just say for that example, right? They may have the capacity to be able to work from an endurance perspective, but repeatability is going to be the biggest thing for them. So we may focus more alactic stuff in the beginning of training. That way we build the base that's necessary. That's going to come as a byproduct of it when you're doing any sort of sport. So for me, I try to look at those things early on and assess, okay, based on what you're showing me, based on the training models, based on how you're actually going and other markers as well, like using a whoop or using a polar that gives me an understanding as to how high they're getting, especially from a maximal perspective, and then seeing how they recover within those recovery sessions, whether it be 30 seconds, whether it be a minute and things like that. So the most that I've seen, actually, one of my guys, he's gone up to like 195 from a heart rate perspective, and he was able to bring it down 20, 30 beats just from just recovering, right? But a lot of that didn't have to do with just being here. Like this is like strength training in itself is literally 1%. And that's what I try to tell people all the time. Like this is not going to be an extreme predicative of your success. If anything, it's just going to help with compounding what it is that you're already good at, right? So within these things, what I try to make sure of, like I said, is making them keen on understanding not only are you doing things coordinative wise, right? We're getting you stronger, we're getting you faster, but how are you breathing too? There was actually a study that came out where your jawline actually has an effect on how you breathe and how you produce maximal power, right? A lot of times, like, when we're taking people through movements, it's like, okay, you're taught to brace, you're taught to do all these things, which is necessary. But I've seen guys, even on social media, where they're getting lip biters, they're getting mouth guards, and they're actually focusing on stabilizing the body within itself because that's when you're able to produce the most power. It doesn't mean that you need to clench your jaw every single time you're doing a maximal lift, but that's also going to be a component as to how you're not only taking in oxygen but releasing CO2 and everything else with it. Breath work in itself, like I'm telling you, man, like I could go on for days about this. It's insane. I try to structure breath work into within every single session. So especially if I know that they're a fighter and they're doing all this stuff, I may try to focus on more hypoxic work. So just really just restrictive breathing, breathing through the nasal passages and allowing for, more utilization to be formed into this play. I don't know if you're too familiar with Evan Pycon. So Evan Pycon, he has this device. It's called a Nox. And so it allows you kind of similar to, I don't know if you're familiar with the Moxie. A little bit, no, not.
I've heard of it, never used one though.
So it's basically a marker for allowing you to understand how nitric oxide is being produced in your body, blood oxygenation, and also deliverance from both utilization and deliverance. So in this realm, what I've seen is that people especially that are explosive, they have a high deliverance, right? Because they're delivering blood and oxygen at such a fast rate that when they begin to recover, it starts to kind of trickle down a little bit. Now, a lot of research has to go into it, and obviously, if you're working with like a physiologist of some sort, they'll kind of guide you with it. But the little experience that I've had with it, I've noticed that when using it, the trends were pretty observable from that point. Like I had a guy, like I said, he was an explosive, just he could just go, 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 go. But then when it came to about the sixth or seventh round of like a Tabitha, he's starting to drop off crazy, right? And a lot of that had to do with how he was breathing, how he was recovering at that point. And so what I said to myself was just saying, hey, look, if we're going to be doing this, right, we need to teach you just simply how to breathe, right? Sometimes you'll get athletes putting nasal strips across their mouths or just focusing, like I said, on hypoxic breathing, but box breathing, breath of fire, even who's the guy? Who's the breath work guy? Wim Hof, doing Wim Hof stuff too, that'll help with understanding how to control, parasympathetic response or sympathetic response. And you see that a lot in UFC, like Sean O'Malley, Israel Adesanya, a lot of those big guys, like when they're getting into the next round, you notice that their breathing is much more controlled at a better rate because that's all that they focused on during camp.
Breath work is huge, and I think that is it kind of goes through the trend cycle. Like people get really fired up about breath work, and then other people say like, just as long as you're not going to pass out, it doesn't really matter. And
Yeah.
I think even at its peak, when some people say that breath work is overhyped, I personally still believe it's still severely underrated. And I mentioned this in a interview with Andrew Zaragoza a couple weeks ago. In Karate Kid 3, Terry Silver puts Danielson on notice and he says, look, I think it's like rule 2 of the Quicksilver fighting system. If a man can't breathe, he can't fight. And it was corny back then, but it's the truth today. So I
It
think
is the truth.
I think breath work is huge, and it's awesome to see the work that you're doing in the breath work realm with your fighters. And man, I'm super stoked for this conversation. I've learned so much already. As we're getting kind of down to the end, I have some rapid fire questions for you. They don't necessarily need to be rapid fire answers.
Mhm.
But the first question I have is something like some of the most common comments that I get on my social media and YouTube is all about condensed conjugate. And so and I know you're very familiar with the condensed conjugate model. So what would you say are like the top one or two misunderstandings or common mistakes that you see coaches make when implementing condensed conjugate?
Um, Honestly, with condensed conjugate, like any program, it has its merits, right? Again, you're going off of maximal, you're going off of submaximal, you're going off of three-wave increments, and it's good, right? And if you do it right, you may not even need to, have to switch off the programming as much. If you're doing it exclusively off camp, that's great too. But I think people kind of have this diehard mentality, like I was saying before. We have a tendency where we live in absolutes. It's not the end all be all, right? Like I've used it a lot with a lot of the UFC guys and gals that I've worked with, and even some grapplers too. And again, it's a threshold to where you can build the athlete to become stronger and also, more explosive. But we also have to make sure that we're blending other things in place rather than just staying absolute in one, right? And that's why, whether it be in conjugate, whether it be in triphasic, or even linear progression, right, there has to be variability in mind, but it has to be done so in a way where we're not just allowing the athlete, especially if they're advanced, to just do the same thing over and over again, right? Because your body at a certain point is going to plateau. So it's just having the understanding that if you've been running it, condensed conjugate year round, sure, you can do it for a sense of readiness and preparation. But if there's other focal points like trying to get the athlete stronger, getting them more mobile, you might want to add some other things into it. And another thing too is that they kind of misunderstand the model when in reality it's not necessarily a block scheme. And I think that a lot of people think that it is. It's literally linear periodization, right? Everything from a charting perspective, the goal is to always bring the athlete up, right? Even when you have them in the middle of plateauing, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing, but especially if they're advanced, you need to place a different stimulus on them so that way they're not just getting the same thing over and over again, right? if you're beginning and even intermediate, you're going to see a lot of strength gain early on. But if you've been lifting weights or been an athlete for, 7, 10 years, right? Your body's going to need something different outside of that in that realm because it's like you can do that. You can run it with amateurs. You can run it with some pros. Especially in grappling too. Like it's really formidable in grappling, especially from a time variance standpoint. But again, everything has its merit, you know.
For sure. For sure. One thing that I have I've been really inspired by that you've done is that when I first met you, I think we had both just recently graduated with our bachelors in college, and now circling back and hanging out again. Now you have your master's in exercise physiology, if I'm correct.
Yep.
And you also have like just so much experience coaching real athletes in the gym. And then you also have this formal education side. And from my perspective, it seems like the gap between formal education and the coaches that are just like grinding away in the gym, that gap is only getting bigger and bigger. So, what's your take on that gap between the guys that are just doing the studies, that just doing the formal education stuff, and then also the guys that are only in the gym working with athletes?
It's kind of both ends where you have to put yourself in a position to acquire as much information as possible. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go to school, get your bachelor's and your master's, because there's a lot of good coaches that I've met that don't even have a degree, right? They've been doing this 15, 20 years and they've just been around such high level coaches because of their understanding and expertise. But I would say for the person that wants to understand, get a taste of both sides, right? Understand anatomy, physiology, but then understand how to apply anatomy and physiology to an actual person, right? Everything that they kind of teach within the NSCA, and even if you're a personal trainer in NASM, right? It's all clinician based stuff. The NSCA will give you a practical understanding as to how to run groups in that manner, but you also have to keep in perspective that if you're taking on 50, 60, 70 athletes, you're not going to be able to run the same thing all the time with every single one of them, right? So there has to be a variance in place for both. And then mostly communication. It doesn't matter how much knowledge that you have. If you don't know how to parlay the information to a person, it doesn't matter, right? I have to be able to condense things down in a way where I'm talking to a 5 year old. So even though there may be moments where I'll be a little nerdy and go on tangents, I try to simplify it for them as best as possible because at the end of the day, like we're not training scientists, we're training athletes, unless they want to put themselves in a position to understand why. Okay, great. I can give you the run on play, whatever. But for the most part, for the person that wants to understand this realm is that number one, you can't deal in absolutes. You just can't, right? The same way that you try to run an athlete is not the same way that you should be running a kid, right? Secondly, you're focusing on different experimentations. You're working on different hypotheses. Even though, like I said, linear progression at all in all is true. It's been tried, tested so many different times. You still need to expose yourself to other methodologies and disciplines because that's what will allow you to be the best coach that you can be. Like I look at it from a standpoint of a jack of all trades, but a master of one, but it's often not times better than a master of one, right? So in that regard, you have to know just enough. You have to know a little bit to get yourself in a different position to understand, okay, I'm not just focusing on just being linear progression. I'm not just focusing on conjugate. I need to understand spinal engine theory. I need to understand, plyometric speed training, things like that, because this is what will allow you to become a great coach. And if you're an athlete, even better, it's going to make you a great athlete.
I dig it. I think you bring up the harsh truth that no coach wants to admit, that the athletes literally could not care less about the science behind all the stuff that we love studying. They're just there to like, sometimes they don't even want to be there to lift. They're like, hey, coach told me to be here. Listen, to give me the sets and reps and let me get out of here. Uh,
Yeah.
last question for you. What would you say is the biggest thing in strength and conditioning or sports performance as a whole that you've changed your mind on over the last couple of years?
Um, I would say being patient, right? Like patience in this field, you have to have it, whether it be with yourself, whether it be with athletes, clientele that you may have. Um, because everything has become so revolutionized, especially within the last 5 to 7 years of AI, right? Like I have some people that come to me saying, "Hey, I don't want to coach with you. Like I can just use ChatGPT." That's great. I want you to use ChatGPT because rather than me having to explain a periodization model for you, you can look at that. But again, if you're talking to somebody that's at a high level, that's doing things at this point, that can only do so much for them, and sometimes it's inaccurate. So in that capacity, what I try to make sure of is that, okay, if you're going to get the information, get it in a way to where it becomes generalized, right? There's so many different books out there that you can use and read, like, what is it? The Yuri's the speed and development for plyometrics, like Yuri's stuff, right? That goes back 40, 50, even 60 years at this point. And Soviets used it for a very long time. Now it's just a matter of saying, okay, if I'm going to use this information and apply it now, I have to be able to understand what type of model that I need to go off of to ensure that the athlete is getting what they need and that the information is being conveyed. If I'm doing hypertrophy work, right, I may go off of Dorian Yates. I may go off of Arnold Schwarzenegger, honestly, like a lot of those different guys, because they do have an understanding of it based on a metabolic response. But we also have to look at it from a perspective that, your body's going to be different than my body, right? The amount of stress that I can place on my body, again, I've been doing this, I'm about 15, yeah, about 15 years. Like, I need something different outside of what I've been doing. And I think that, again, that just goes back into saying variability matters. You have to be able to know what hypothesis you're testing out, ensure that it works first and foremost, and then use it and plug and play as you go along, as you start to kind of build more into, programming, coaching, and all those applications that you can kind of put in place.
Man, I love it. Thank you so much, Kaelan, for taking the time to chat with me today. I think everyone listening is they should like spin the block on this episode and listen to it 2 or 3 times because we gave some great protocols on how you implement the strength and conditioning coaching with your athletes, how you're helping them enhance their performance just as an athlete. That some athletes are hobbyists, some of them are high level competitors. And so I think there's a lot of great value that people can get from this episode. Where can people find you? And do you have anything exciting that you want to plug before we dip out today?
Nothing exciting. You can find me on Instagram, coach.k underscore. Obviously, Josh, he's done a really great job, and keep supporting him. I love the content that you're putting out, and again, I'm plug and playing every single thing that you're doing on a day to day.
I dig it. I dig it. Well, thank you so much, man. Lift heavy, roll hard. Catch y'all later. Peace.